So I think we sometimes get into a trap of trying to gather all the data,
Mm.
and I don't know that that helps us.
Well, I mean, they always say, like, don't collect the data you don't want to analyze,
Mm.
don't they? Hi, guys. Welcome back to Quality Coffee Break. Now, in this episode, we are going to be talking about data analysis. Now, specifically, that data that you want to be looking at when your product is on the market and you want to make sure everything is a-okay with your product. So what processes you should be using to make sure that you have conforming product out on the market.
That's right. And we wanna look at conforming product and keep an eye on that and be aware of emerging trends or early warning signs that we wanna address right away and how we might look for those or how we might identify those. And then also wanna talk a little bit about how we monitor the quality management system itself. Also required, also important.
Also required, also important. So yeah, as you can see, we're looking into clause 8, which I think I've said many times before. It's one of my favorite clauses, because it's not all about getting it right first time every time. Because if you did, clause 8 wouldn't exist.
Right, right. So I'm gonna start. I do have notes today, so
Amazing.
don't mind me looking down at paper. Um, so because I wanted to highlight a couple of things. Overall, it's clause 8.1 that talks about that's requiring monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes for demonstrating the conformity of the product, conformity of the QMS, and effectiveness of the QMS. So those are your North stars. That's your purpose, that's your mission with all of your monitoring and measuring activities, right? You're looking at, is the product acceptable? Does it meet our needs? Is it effective? Is it safe? You're looking at, does the quality management system, is it being implemented appropriately? Are we following it correctly? And then also, is it effective? So that's what we want to talk about. We're not going to talk about the data analysis that you might be doing to release product to market. So your finished product QC activities, um, pre-release, we're not going to be talking about that today. That's a bit different. So I wanted to start about the product. Let's talk about the product and then we'll talk about processes. So when you have a product on market, you have obviously we have our post-market surveillance criteria and you'll have procedures for that and activities associated with that. But one of those primary elements of your post-market surveillance is product complaints. Now, we all hope that we don't get complaints, but we're going to get complaints or feedback from our customers and from our users. And it's important that we take that information and we not only evaluate it for its specific issue, right? And the risk and associated with that report and what we need to do to rectify the situation for that customer. But it's really important to look at those in aggregate. And we look at our complaints like from a higher level perspective, what kinds of complaints are we getting at what rate? And then have that information feedback into our product development process. Really, what's our next design change potentially? Do we need a design change to address some of these complaints? Do we need additional customer education? Where are we going with this? So I think complaints are sort of the best feedback that you can get because it is directly from your user and from your customer.
Absolutely. With regards to kind of, the post-market surveillance activities, so your post-market surveillance plan, now we know that different jurisdictions call it something different, don't they? You have to have, whatever, but we can just generally just consider it as your post-market surveillance plan. That should be detailing what you should be looking out for in your post-market surveillance. When are you, when are you broaching those thresholds, which you might think, now, I think we're now getting into danger territory now. So we've got some trending data which shows that perhaps some aspects of the design aren't working as well as we first hoped. And not forgetting that once your device is out on the market, you are going to start seeing all these weird and wonderful things that in your design validation you thought it weren't going to be an issue. Unfortunately, that's just the case, isn't it, Susie? It's just the case that that is what is going to happen. So within your post-market surveillance plan, you should be outlining very, very clearly what are your thresholds where you need to really consider whether action needs to be taken.
Right. And one of the interesting things when you're talking about a new product development is that your failure modes and effects analysis, your FMEAs, your design and your product FMEAs that might talk about manufacturing, generally you're including an occurrence, like a rate of occurrence and a severity and like a probability. Like those are the kinds of things that are going into your risk analysis, right? But they're theoretical when you're starting because you don't I mean, you do your best and you use mathematical models and you look at other products that are on the market and you take all of the available information and you make your best assessment, but it's not tested. It's that product isn't on the market. So one of the things that I think is important to do is once you're starting to get complaints and feedback in from the market is to verify your assumptions that were in your FMEAs.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And maybe we should do like an episode on risk management because I think sometimes it is quite tricky, isn't it? It's like where do you get all of this sort of initial data from where you're thinking, oh, I think, it's going to be relatively frequent or infrequent, because it's all, based on sort of like a logical assumption based on, state of the art, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to get into too much detail about that, but yeah, actually having that real world data to then pull back into your risk management system. So your post market surveillance support report should be pulling that information and then you're always going to be feeding into that overall benefit risk analysis.
Right. Right. And then another area or another data point I think that helps us assess product conformity or ongoing product conformity is our non-conforming product reports. I mean, it's in there in the name, but when we see these, and it depends on the kind of product that you're making and who's making it and who's using it and all of that stuff. But um, you might have a lot of your non-conforming product reports in-house. Hopefully, like you want them to be detected while they're still in your control before they're out in the field. Um, so this will be really interesting information to say, oh, well, the weight was wrong. I mean, if it's one of these things where you're filling volumes of liquid or something like that, and you're assessing it by weight. Oh, these weights were too high, so our volumes were off. We weren't filling it accurately. Um, or the labeling was wrong time and time again, or how many times these different things happen that make it non-conforming. Um, even things like temperature excursions and storage temperature excursions, while on the face of it don't really affect doesn't seem to be part of that product design, but it gives you information that you can evaluate, because how many can we prevent if we can do some additional work to make this stable at different temperature ranges? Or if it's really hard, if you have something like a -80 freezer, that might be really hard to maintain, and you might see a lot of temperature excursions. So is it possible that we can get this to -20? Even that might help us. So, I think looking at non-conforming product as a again, not just what are we doing about this one particular case, but as an input into our product and program, I think is really helpful.
I think you just raised a really good point there as well, because even when you've gone through submission and we know, that's quite a stressful process in itself, and you've got clearance and you're on market, you don't there are always going to be things that you're going to find out about your product. And in terms of like the -80, the minus, you know, the -20 freezer, because when you first go in, I like to think that people are quite risk averse. So they think, right, okay, well, if this reagent, for example, needs to be frozen, let's put it in the most coldest state ever. So let's go on a -80. But as you are quite right, -20 might be okay. And it just gives you that really good example of why it's important is to keep monitoring your processes, especially your manufacturing processes, because you don't know how you might be able to make improvements to your manufacturing process, you know, lessen control and actually save money for the company. I could
Well,
also
yeah,
argue there was also that.
definitely. You know, and that usually gets a good reaction from the from the finance department, right?
Yeah, it's just like, oh, I think we could reduce the temperature. Do it. Put a change control
Yeah,
first.
let's do the studies, do what we need to do. Yeah.
Yeah, do what you need
Yeah.
to do. Yeah.
And then I will circle back to quality control testing again, not as that pre-release state, but as a valuable source of information to mine for information on about your product, right? So I don't know. It depends on the device that you're making, but let's just say your one of your quality control measures is is a measurement, right? Maybe you're measuring a particular size of the device or something like that, and you're doing this on a right. For your quality control testing, you're going to do this on a sampling basis. You're not testing everyone or something like that. But what that tells you over time is if there is drift, right? So if you're looking, okay, this lot's released, this is great. All of my criteria were met. All of my acceptance or criteria met for me, 10 lots in a row. Great. That's amazing. But it's helpful to take a step back and look at it and say, it's acceptable, but is it slowly increasing or is it slowly decreasing? Are we dealing with issues related to the wear of the tooling or something like that? Um, if it's if it's like a test methodology or something like that, you know, I work in IVDs, so you might have test methodologies. There is going to be an output to that test methodology and acceptance criteria. So how does that compare over time? And I'm also going to say that while it's important to look at it, it's also important to put it in perspective because it's not appropriate or it's not helpful to have a really knee-jerk reaction at every slight change, right? You want to be able to identify when you're in sort of normal variation, like this is always going to kind of go up and down, but we're going to be within this band and this is normal experience. And then we want to be able to point out now we're in an abnormal state, and so maybe it's worth looking at a little bit deeper.
Hmm. Yeah. So you're like saying you're like alert. I traditionally know them as like alert and action levels, but I think people call them like different things, don't they? So it's just like if you move into the alert range, then yeah, we need to sort of take a look at this to sort of get us back into that normal range.
Yeah, and that's where statistical process controls can really help. It is intended to take a large amount of data that you've gathered and create your or assess, you know, what's your normal cause variation versus the special cause variation, and it can be really helpful. It can also be challenging as a young company to have enough data to really have valuable or to create effective statistical process charts. But it's a goal. Yeah. So those are the things that I think kind of wrap up the product. Those are the data points that I think you can look at for assessing product. Now, in terms of like how do you do it? Um, you're gonna look, you know, your complaints. I mean, this seems pretty basic, but I'll say it anyway. You want to identify those by type. What's your failure mode? You're going to organize your failure modes, identify those failure modes, and then and monitor those over time. And normalize it per product sold or per product manufactured or something like that. And that's what you're really gonna look. All right, so let's look on our processes and how we can monitor processes and do the data analysis that really helps that. So, Amy, what are your ideas about the QMS processes that would benefit from this kind of data analysis?
Well, for me, you're always going to be looking at your internal audit process and your CAPAs, right? Because they are going to be really looking at your whole system, how they interact, and making sure that things are or your processes are, they're effective. Because that's a part of Section 8, isn't it? We need to make sure that our QMS is continually effective. Not forgetting that your internal audit process needs to be scheduled in terms of the risk of the process. So we can always link that now, can't we, to how much of an impact that actually has on our product. And you can see that there's just direct links. You notice direct processes, that direct link between if that process is going to be non-conforming, then what the impact is on your product. Then my suggestion there would be to always audit those processes more frequently than perhaps your indirect processes. So for me, yeah, looking at your internal audit processes, looking at those QC, those release procedures, looking at your compliance procedures. Are we actually being proactive in terms of getting that data as well? Are we actually being proactive about it? Are we just waiting for management review to look at things, or are we being reliant on process owners to make sure that they are proactively, collecting the data, which would be then used to inform us about how effective those processes are?
Exactly. I think, it's important to identify the processes that we're following and ensuring that we as an organization are successful in following our own rules and the guidances that we've created for ourselves and the procedures that we've created for ourselves. We have to follow those and we have to
Mm.
maintain those. And that's also part of the standard, right? You have to establish and maintain and then also ensure that it's effective, right? So for um Kappas in particular, like, this is where you do a lot of, trending activities and really distinct trending activities, and that can be challenging with an early stage company. Just like as I mentioned, uh, a little bit ago, if you don't have a ton of data, then it's hard to get statistically valid results. And so it doesn't mean that you're exempt from doing this monitoring just because you maybe only have, 5 or 10 kappas a month or something like that. It just means you need to be creative about how you're, um, determining your trends or what you're calling a trend. And it might be sort of minimally statistical, right? Because it might just be about occurrence levels. If this has increased in occurrence month over month, then that might be a trend. Or if if you see the same uh, procedure that fails time and time again, then that you might consider that a trend, or at least something that's worth investigating at a deeper level.
Yeah, it's really difficult for small companies, just to add to your point, to really get to really sort of put their hands on their heart and say, yeah, no, this is definitely I think it's something which you just need to have a general talk about and have, a justification as to why this is a problem. One thing that I always think about, especially when it comes to where processes need improvement, is as small companies do, they grow, and sometimes they grow quite quickly. Now, the flip side of this is that I think it really tests your procedures and it really tests your training processes when you have this new influx of staff. Now, if you're seeing that every single time, someone new is being trained up on this procedure and they're signed off as competent, and there's deviation, deviation. I mean, that's got to be talking to you about, okay, well, either the training process isn't good here, or the process just isn't up to standard. I think a few episodes ago we were talking about, how important it is for your training program and everything, and this is just kind of sort of, talking about that again, if you allow me. But I think yeah, for smaller companies is definitely when you don't have a lot of data, there is that additional pressure.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one of these things that you need to look at and you need to take action. You need to know when it's appropriate to
Yeah.
take action. You can't or shouldn't jump at every event. You need to sort of just let that process run, but you need to be monitoring your processes as well. Obviously, as the as the clause is titled, right? It's we're talking about monitoring and measurement. So you should be looking at this monthly, quarterly, perhaps, depending on the record and depending on your volume of that record. And you also wanna make sure that people are creating the records when they should be. And this is, again, where your audit process kicks in. Your internal audit process is another level of ensuring compliance to the procedures because your internal audit is likely to identify whether people are correctly creating their kappas or their deviations when an event happens during manufacture or during testing or whatever the process might be during operations. And so you have to have those records created at the appropriate time in order to ha- have those as valuable inputs into your, you know, process assessment, process effectiveness measurement. Because if you don't have the records, you could be thinking that the system works. We don't have any problems. We don't have any CAPAs initiated. But if it's just that people aren't creating them when they should be, then it's training and that sort
Yeah.
of thing. But you don't have an accurate reflection of what's happening in your QMS. So all of these things work together. Your internal audits, your trending, your individual record creation, it all works together.
Mm. And I know we just did an episode on change management, which is why it's just so maybe so fresh in my mind. But one could argue that you can actually use that as an input as well. Presentation, right? So if so for example, new process has been implemented. Let's use it implement. The sign off has been implemented, it's been effective and what have you. And then your internal audit process goes and looks at it. So, well, actually, hang on a minute, these records haven't been created. Where are these? This hasn't been signed off by, the person responsible for the process. Why hasn't that happened? So then
And
you're kind of looking at, well, maybe the implementation for that change control wasn't done right. So your data also be capturing perhaps failures in your change management system as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
definitely, definitely. Again, all processes
need to
should
change.
be monitored,
Yes.
right? So that includes your change control process and it includes it's not just your CAPAs and it's not just your complaints, even though that's what we've kind of been talking about most. It's all the processes. So that's a great point, Amy. We need to be looking at all of it. And so I do this by generally having there's a couple things. Number 1, you're gonna have your quality objectives, right? So, you might have quality objectives that are about your, compliance to SOPs or your training effectiveness, or you might have, objectives about all these different elements. So, that should be evaluated regularly. But also, you're not gonna have a quality objective for every last thing. Like, that doesn't make sense, right? So, you should be monitoring this as a quality professional, you should be hosting, I'd say, a monthly or a quarterly review meeting with your operational leaders, not only to talk about progress to the objectives, but also what are some of the other systems that require monitoring and what are we learning from them? So if you're talking about your CAPA process, for instance, your objective might be an overall reduction in CAPAs, but there are other things that are valuable to know about the health of that system. How many are being completed on time? How many need extensions? How many are, and which organization or which department seems to have trouble with that? And is that a resource problem? Is that a training problem? Is that, just an oversight problem? Where does that go? So there's a lot that can be and probably should be discussed or evaluated to determine the health of the QMS, regardless of whether it's an official quality objective.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the quality objectives, they set out your reason for the business, don't they? So they're also, built from your quality policy. It's what is meant for you as a business. They're going to be different from business to business to business. So having that absolute management commitment to say that, hey, these are the things that are important to us. And then saying to process owners, you got to keep an eye on this because this is integral. This is core to our business. These are our values. So, making sure that they are being monitored and bringing them up, like quarterly process owner reviews. Don't wait for management review to see how well your processes are doing. Don't wait. Why? Why? Make sure you're continually monitoring them and making sure that you're bringing to attention those areas for improvement.
Yeah,
Mm.
because these events, these regular monitoring activities really are part of the management review program. You might only have an annual or a semi-annual quote unquote management review meeting. But all of these activities that you do, the reports that you send monitoring the health of the QMS, the meetings that you hold where you're reporting out on objectives or other key performance indicators, like this all contributes to the management review program to ensure. And remember what the point of that is. The point isn't just to create a report for report's sake. The point is to ensure that the upper management is aware of the activities that are happening, right? So you need to ensure that your CEO or your COO are fully aware of the challenges that you face and the challenges that your product might face, as well as the things that you're doing well.
Okay, so putting this into sort of a worked example, and we sort of know the sort of standard statistical terms like mean, mode, median, all that kind of thing. But Susie, in your opinion, where would be the best place to use these techniques?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And the answer is, of course, that it depends. And I think all of these different tools have their purposes, right? So you might be, if you're talking about like time to completion, if that's, say, your measurement of whatever the record is, and you're just looking at how long does it take us to do this? I mean, average is great, and that might be just a target for you. You're like, look, on average, we want to complete our corrective action records within 60 days. So it's an easy measurement. And you know that there are going to be more complex corrective actions and there are going to be less complex corrective actions. So maybe that spread isn't important to you because you're like, we know that there are things that are going to be able to be closed in 2 days, and we know that there are things that are going to be out for 6 months because that's the nature of the business and the complexity is going to vary. So maybe average is all you're really interested in that moment. And there are other things where maybe that spread or that standard deviation is really important. And maybe you're looking at, say, your quality control data. And if whatever the thing is that you're measuring has a range of acceptability, then maybe measuring that you can look at the mean, you can also look at the standard deviation, or you can do like those box and whisker plots, right? Where you have the mean and then the different quartiles and stuff like that. And it allows you to see that the spread is quite wide or quite narrow. And so that tells you something about the control of that process as well. So I think it kind of depends, I'd say, on the type of data or that you're looking at. And that if you are monitoring something that itself has a range, then I would say using a range based measurement is beneficial. And if you're looking at something that is, binary or, then you're gonna then maybe a mean is better or a median is better. I think there are a lot of different options out there, and I think that they all tell you different things and they all can be valuable. So the other cautionary tale I'd say is when you're creating your objective or your target, be really specific about how you're going to measure it because you can be going along and say we're measuring the mean and that's the thing that we're interested in. We're talking about days to closure and that's the only thing that we're really interested in this moment. It's really easy to get distracted by other types of data. Like when you slice it in different ways and then you might be in this loop of is that a problem? Is that not a problem? Where am I going with this? What is this really telling me? And it might just be a distraction. So I'd say pick what you're going to be focused on first and then and work towards that. And then say you've gotten that down really well. Maybe you're like, you know what, our time to closure is great. And we don't have to really look at this anymore. We're going to change our focus to something else. And maybe that's going to be an overall you know, n rate or number of errors or something like that, and then you're gonna look at that differently. So, I think we sometimes get into a trap of trying to gather all the data, and I don't know that that helps us.
I
Like
mean, they always say, like, "Don't collect the data you don't wanna analyze," don't they?
yeah,
Well, they. I mean, who's they?
who's they?
They.
They
People.
found advice they've got?
Yeah. Yeah, don't collect what you don't wanna analyze because, yeah, it's just a waste of time really, isn't it? But, yeah, thank you, Susie. That clarified my question. Um, I believe that covers data
Yeah,
analysis.
yeah, I think that wraps it up for this episode.
So until next time, guys.
Don't panic. Read the SOP.